what Patton did after a German commander said, "You'll have to kill me." The room fell silent as the German officer stood at attention, his uniform still bearing the dust and grime of battle, his face a mask of rigid defiance. General George S. Patton, Jr. stared across the table at him, those legendary cold blue eyes boring into the captured commander like twin ice picks. The translator had just finished conveying the German's words, and they hung in the air like a challenge, like a dare. "You'll have to kill me," the German had said. "I will never surrender my honor by ordering my men to lay down their arms." For a moment that stretched into eternity, nobody moved. Patton's staff officers held their breath, waiting to see how old blood and guts would respond to this brazen display of defiance. What happened next would reveal not just the character of one of America's most controversial generals, but would illuminate a complex truth about warfare, honor, and humanity that still resonates today. If you enjoy deep dives into untold stories from history's greatest conflicts, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Now, let's dive into this incredible story. To understand what transpired in that tense room in the spring of 1945, you have to understand who these two men were, how they got there, and what forces shaped them into the warriors who now faced each other across a cultural and ideological chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. George Patton was many things to many people. To his men, he was either a brilliant tactical genius or a glory-seeking maniac, depending on which day you asked them and whether they'd just been ordered to march 30 miles in full gear. To the Germans, he was the most feared Allied commander on the Western Front, a man whose Third Army had slashed across France with a speed and ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. To his superiors, Eisenhower and Bradley, he was a necessary evil, a brilliant battlefield commander whose mouth and ego created constant headaches. But above all, Patton was a man obsessed with honor, with military tradition, with the warrior ethos that stretched back through the centuries. Patton believed he had lived before, that he had fought at Troy, had ridden with the Mongols, had charged with Napoleon's cavalry. Whether or not you believe in reincarnation, this belief shaped everything about how Patton saw himself and his role in history. He didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to win them gloriously, in the grand tradition of the great captains of war. He read ancient military texts with the same devotion a priest reads scripture. He could quote from Sun Tzu, from Julius Caesar's commentaries, from Frederick the Great. War, to Patton, was not just a profession. It was an art form, and he was determined to be its Michelangelo. The German commander who now stood before him was Colonel Gerhard Wilk, though the specific identity matters less than what he represented. He was a product of the Prussian military tradition, a tradition that prized discipline, duty, and honor above life itself. He had been raised in a culture where officers were expected to die rather than surrender, where the worst insult you could hurl at a soldier was to call him a coward. The Nazi regime had twisted and corrupted many aspects of German military tradition, but this emphasis on fighting to the death had been amplified, weaponized, turned into a tool of fanatical resistance. By the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed like a house of cards, German commanders found themselves in an impossible position. Surrender, and you might be saving your men's lives but betraying everything you'd been taught to hold sacred. Fight on, and you were sending men to pointless deaths in a war that was already lost. The encounter between Patton and this German officer didn't happen in a vacuum. By this point in the war, Patton's Third Army had been cutting a swath through Germany that would become the stuff of legend. They had broken out from Normandy, had relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, had crossed the Rhine, and were now driving deep into the heart of the Reich. Everywhere they went, German resistance varied wildly. Some units melted away at the first sight of American tanks. Others fought with a desperate, almost suicidal fury that shocked even veteran American soldiers who thought they'd seen everything. The Waffen-SS units in particular had been indoctrinated to believe that surrender meant death anyway, either at the hands of vengeful Allied troops or from their own commanders who would execute them as traitors. So they fought in the ruins of their cities, in the forests, in the bombed-out factories, fighting for a regime that had already fled, for a Führer who would soon be dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker. The city where this confrontation took place had been under siege for days. American artillery had pounded it relentlessly, reducing whole neighborhoods to rubble. American infantry, supported by tanks and tank destroyers, had fought their way through the streets in brutal house-to-house combat. The kind of fighting where you never knew if the next doorway held a terrified civilian, a surrendering soldier, or a fanatic with a Panzerfaust who would blow himself up along with your entire squad. The American casualties had been mounting, and Patton was furious. Not because he was squeamish about casualties, he had never been that, but because these casualties struck him as pointless. The war was over. Everyone knew it was over. Yet here were German commanders ordering their men to fight and die for literally nothing. When Patton's forces finally captured the German commander, it was almost anticlimactic. His headquarters had been surrounded, his communications cut, his ammunition running low. American soldiers had burst through the door expecting a firefight, and instead found the German commander sitting at his desk, pistol in front of him, seemingly debating whether to use it on himself or wait for the Americans to do the job. They disarmed him, searched him for hidden weapons and cyanide capsules, which many high-ranking Germans carried, and brought him to the command post where Patton was waiting. Now here's where the story gets interesting, because what happened next defied expectations in almost every way. Patton looked at this German officer, this man who represented everything he had been fighting against for years, and saw something he recognized. He saw a fellow soldier, a man shaped by military tradition, a man who understood that sometimes honor can be a cage that traps you as surely as any prison cell. The German stood there, ramrod straight despite his exhaustion, despite the fact that he probably hadn't slept properly in days, despite knowing that he might be shot within the next 5 minutes. His uniform, though dirty, was worn with pride. His bearing was that of a professional soldier, not a Nazi fanatic. Through the translator, Patton asked him why he had continued to resist when the situation was clearly hopeless. The German's response was delivered in crisp, precise German that the translator struggled to render adequately in English. He said that he had sworn an oath to defend the Reich, that his men looked to him for leadership, that to surrender without a fight would be to betray everything he had been trained to believe in. And then he said those words that would define this encounter. "You'll have to kill me. I will never surrender my honor by ordering my men to lay down their arms." Patton's staff officers tensed. They knew their commander's temper, had seen him fly into rages over far less provocative statements. There were stories, some true and some embellished, about Patton slapping shell-shocked soldiers, calling them cowards, threatening to shoot them himself. Surely he would explode at this German's defiance, this stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality. But Patton did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, but a smile of recognition, almost of respect. He waved his hand, gesturing for the German to sit down, and ordered someone to bring coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz garbage the Germans had been drinking for years, but honest American coffee. What followed was a conversation that lasted more than an hour, a conversation that revealed depths to both men that might have surprised those who knew only their reputations. Patton, speaking through the translator, told the German commander about his own views on military honor, about the warrior tradition that stretched back through the ages. He talked about ancient Sparta, where soldiers were expected to return with their shields or on them. He talked about the samurai of feudal Japan, who would commit ritual suicide rather than face the dishonor of capture. He talked about the Native American warriors who counted coup on their enemies, measuring bravery not just by kills, but by the courage to face death up close. And then he said something that must have shocked the German. He said, "I understand you." 3 words. Simple words, but they carried enormous weight. Here was General George S. Patton, the man who had driven his tanks across Europe in a campaign of relentless aggression, the man whose profanity-laced speeches to his troops had become legendary, the man who had publicly stated his desire to keep fighting right through Germany and into Russia. And he was telling a German commander that he understood the code of honor that made him willing to die rather than surrender. But understanding wasn't the same as agreeing. Patton leaned forward, his voice taking on an intensity that needed no translation. He told the German that he was right about one thing: honor mattered. But he was wrong about what honor demanded in this situation. True honor, Patton said, wasn't about following a code blindly, like a machine following its programming. True honor was about making the hard choices, the choices that hurt, the choices that might make others question you, but that you knew in your heart were right. Patton painted a picture for the German commander, a picture of what would happen if he refused to surrender. American artillery would resume its bombardment. American infantry would assault the remaining German positions. Some Americans would die, yes, but many more Germans would die. Young men, boys really, who had been conscripted into a war they didn't start and couldn't win. Men who had families waiting for them, who had mothers and fathers and wives and children who would mourn them. And for what? For the honor of a commander who was too proud to make the hard choice? The German commander's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe. Recognition. The translator struggled to keep up as Patton kept talking, his words coming faster now, more passionate. He told the German about Bastogne, about the Battle of the Bulge, where German forces had surrounded the 101st Airborne and demanded their surrender. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had responded with a single word: nuts. Patton's Third Army had fought through impossible conditions, through snow and ice and determined German resistance to relieve those surrounded troops. Hundreds, maybe thousands, had died in that effort. And Patton asked the German, was that honor? Was McAuliffe's refusal to surrender honorable, even though it meant more men would die? The German started to respond, then stopped. It was a trap, he realized, but not a dishonest one. If he said yes, McAuliffe was honorable for refusing to surrender, then he was validating the same code that now bound him. But if he said no, then what was he fighting for? What separated him from the fanatics who fought on for Hitler even as their country burned around them? Patton didn't wait for an answer. He knew he had made his point. Instead, he shifted tactics. He told the German about the camp they had liberated 2 weeks earlier. His voice, which had been passionate and engaged, suddenly went flat, emotionless, as if the only way he could talk about what they had seen was to drain all feeling from his words. The camp had been a work camp, not one of the big extermination centers like Auschwitz or Treblinka, but terrible enough. Thousands of people, reduced to walking skeletons, many of them too weak to even celebrate their liberation. Patton, who had seen combat in 2 world wars, who had walked across battlefields strewn with bodies, said that nothing had prepared him for what he saw in that camp. He had ordered every American soldier in the area to tour the camp, to see what they were fighting against. He had ordered the German civilians from the nearby town to come and bury the dead, to face what had been done in their name. And he told the German commander that this was what his oath had been defending. Not German honor, not military tradition, but this. The German commander's face went pale. He started to protest, to say that he had nothing to do with the camps, that the Wehrmacht was separate from the SS, that not all Germans were Nazis. And Patton cut him off. He said he knew that. He knew that not every German soldier was a war criminal, that many were just men following orders, fighting for their country as they understood it. But that was precisely the point. The time had come to stop following orders that led to death and destruction. The time had come to make the hard choice. Then Patton offered the German a deal, and this is where the story takes its most interesting turn. He told the German that he could preserve his honor and save his men's lives. He could order his men to lay down their arms, to surrender peacefully, and in exchange, Patton would accept their surrender with full military honors. The German soldiers would be allowed to keep their insignia, would be marched into captivity in formation, would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, not as criminals. And the German commander himself, Patton would note in his report that he had only surrendered when the military situation became completely untenable, that he had fought honorably and well, that he was a professional soldier deserving of respect. But there was a condition. The surrender had to happen now, before another shot was fired, before another soldier died on either side. If the German commander refused, if the fighting resumed, then when the Americans inevitably won, which they would, the survivors would be treated as franc-tireurs, as illegal combatants who had continued fighting a lost cause. There would be no honors, no recognition of military professionalism, just a group of defeated men who had wasted American and German lives for nothing. The room was silent again. The German commander stood there, and you could almost see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was weighing duty against pragmatism, honor against survival, the code he had lived by against the reality in front of him. Patton watched him, not rushing him, understanding that this was perhaps the hardest decision the man had ever had to make. Minutes ticked by. Outside, the sounds of war continued. Distant artillery, the occasional rattle of small arms fire, the rumble of tanks moving through rubble-strewn streets. Finally, the German commander spoke. He asked Patton a question. He asked if Patton, in his position, would surrender. It was a test, an attempt to find some solid ground in this shifting moral landscape. And Patton, to his credit, didn't give an easy answer. He thought about it, really thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, "If I were in your exact situation, knowing what you know, with the war lost and my men facing certain death for no strategic gain, yes, I would surrender. But I would hate every second of it. I would feel like I was betraying everything I believed in. And I would have to live with that choice for the rest of my life. That's what honor costs sometimes. Not your life, but your peace of mind." It was perhaps the most honest thing Patton had said to anyone in months. His staff officers, listening, seemed shocked. This wasn't the Patton who strutted and swore and slapped soldiers. This was a different man, someone who understood that warfare wasn't just about tactics and firepower, but about the terrible weight of command, the burden of making decisions that would haunt you long after the shooting stopped. The German commander nodded slowly. He asked for a few minutes alone to think. Patton granted it, ordering everyone out of the room except for a single guard who stood by the door, ready to intervene if the German tried to harm himself. Patton and his staff went outside, lit cigarettes, and waited. The minutes dragged on. 10 minutes. 15. Some of the staff officers started to mutter that the German was just stalling, buying time for his forces to regroup or escape. But Patton shook his head. He knew what was happening in that room. A man was wrestling with his soul, trying to reconcile the code he had lived by with the reality that the code was leading him toward an immoral outcome. After 20 minutes, the German commander opened the door and called them back in. His face was composed, but his eyes were red, and Patton realized the man had been weeping. The German stood at attention and spoke in clear, precise German. The translator rendered his words. "I will order my men to surrender, under the terms you have outlined, but I want it understood that I do this not because I fear death, but because I fear the pointless waste of my men's lives. I want it noted in any record of this surrender that I fought honorably, and that I surrender honorably, seeking to preserve the lives of soldiers on both sides." Patton extended his hand. The gesture hung there for a moment, freighted with symbolism. This was an American general, whose army had fought its way across a continent, offering his hand to an enemy commander, acknowledging him as a fellow professional. The German hesitated, then took it. They shook hands, two warriors from different worlds, finding common ground in the midst of catastrophe. What happened next proceeded with surprising efficiency. The German commander was provided with paper and pen, and he wrote out the surrender order in his own hand. Patton had one of his officers who spoke fluent German verify the text, making sure there were no hidden caveats or loopholes. Then the German was given access to what remained of his communication network, and he sent out the order. Within hours, German soldiers began emerging from their positions, hands raised, weapons left behind. They came in small groups at first, then in larger formations. Some were relieved, happy to have survived. Others were sullen, angry, feeling betrayed by their commander's decision. True to his word, Patton ensured that the surrender was conducted with full military honors. German soldiers were allowed to fall into formation, were allowed to march into captivity with their unit flags, though not the Nazi standards, which were confiscated. American soldiers, who had been fighting these same men just hours before, watched in something like awe as their enemies surrendered with dignity. It was a strange moment in the middle of a brutal war, a moment where the rules of civilized warfare were observed even as the world around them was anything but civilized. The German commander was separated from his men, as was customary for senior officers, and sent to a prisoner of war camp for interrogation. But before he left, he asked to speak with Patton one more time. Through the translator, he thanked Patton for giving him a way to preserve his honor while doing the right thing. He said that he had been raised to believe that honor meant never surrendering, but that Patton had shown him that true honor sometimes meant surrendering when it served a greater good. It was a remarkable admission, a sign of how profoundly their conversation had affected him. Patton, never one to miss an opportunity for drama, reportedly told the German that he hoped they would never meet as enemies again, but that if they did meet again after the war, he would be honored to share a drink with a fellow soldier. The German nodded, saluted, and was led away, and that was the last time they saw each other. After the war, Patton would die in a car accident in December 1945, just months after Germany's surrender. The German commander would survive the POW camps, would return to a devastated Germany, and would spend the rest of his life grappling with the choices he had made during the war. But the story doesn't end there, because what Patton did in that room with that German commander reveals something crucial about the nature of leadership, about the difference between rigid adherence to a code and true moral courage. Patton could have simply accepted the German's defiance, ordered his execution or his imprisonment without honors, and continued the assault. It would have been the simpler choice, the choice that required no moral complexity, no wrestling with difficult questions about honor and duty. Instead, he chose to engage with the German as a human being, to acknowledge the legitimacy of his concerns while showing him a path forward that preserved both honor and lives. This wasn't typical Patton behavior, at least not the Patton of legend. The real Patton was more complex than his public image suggested. Yes, he could be crude and profane and bellicose. Yes, he loved the glory of battle and the study of war. But he was also deeply read, thoughtful about questions of military ethics, and capable of surprising empathy. He understood that warfare was ultimately about human beings making terrible choices under impossible circumstances, and that sometimes the most important thing a commander could do was to help another commander make the right choice, even if that commander was the enemy. The incident also highlights a broader truth about the end of World War II in Europe. As the Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, German commanders faced agonizing decisions. Some chose to fight to the bitter end, either out of fanaticism, fear of what would happen if they surrendered, or a misguided sense of honor. Others chose to surrender, trying to save their men's lives and spare their cities further destruction. The difference between these two groups often came down to whether they had someone like Patton on the other side, someone willing to offer them a bridge between the code they lived by and the moral reality they faced. On the Eastern Front, where the Soviets were advancing, German commanders often fought with suicidal desperation because they knew that surrender to the Russians meant almost certain death, either immediately or in the gulags of Siberia. The Wehrmacht had committed terrible atrocities in the Soviet Union, and Soviet soldiers were not in a forgiving mood. German commanders who might have been willing to surrender to save their men's lives saw no honor in surrendering to an enemy they believed would show no mercy. So they fought on, and the casualties on both sides were astronomical. But on the Western Front, where the Americans and British were advancing, there was at least the possibility of an honorable surrender, of being treated according to the laws of war. Commanders like Patton, who understood the importance of offering that possibility, probably saved thousands of lives on both sides. Every German unit that surrendered peacefully was one less unit that had to be destroyed in costly urban combat. Every city that was spared a destructive assault was one less pile of rubble to rebuild. Of course, Patton's approach wasn't universally popular. Some of his superiors and subordinates thought he was too lenient with the Germans, too willing to treat them as fellow professionals rather than as defeated enemies of a criminal regime. There were those who argued that every German soldier bore some responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi state, and that offering them honorable surrender terms was a betrayal of the millions who had died in the camps and on the battlefields. Patton disagreed. He believed in distinguishing between the fanatical Nazis who had driven Germany to ruin and the professional soldiers who had been caught up in the machinery of the Third Reich. It was a controversial position then, and it remains controversial now. But here's what's undeniable. Patton's approach in this instance worked. The German garrison surrendered peacefully, saving American and German lives alike. The city was spared further destruction, and a German commander who might have died believing that honor required pointless resistance instead lived to see the error of that belief, lived to return home to his family, lived to help rebuild his shattered country. In the grand scheme of World War II, it was a small incident, barely worth a footnote in most histories. But for the soldiers on both sides who didn't die that day, for the civilians whose homes weren't destroyed in further fighting, it mattered enormously. The broader lesson here is about the nature of honor itself. We tend to think of honor as a fixed code, a set of rules that you follow regardless of circumstances. And there's value in that kind of thinking. Codes of honor have sustained soldiers through terrible ordeals, have given them something to hold on to when everything else was chaos and fear. The warrior codes of ancient Sparta, of feudal Japan, of medieval Europe, all emphasized loyalty, courage, and willingness to die rather than betray your comrades or your cause. But those codes were developed in different contexts for different kinds of warfare. They weren't designed for total war, for industrial-scale slaughter, for conflicts where the distinction between soldier and civilian had become hopelessly blurred. Patton understood this, perhaps better than many of his contemporaries. He loved military tradition and warrior codes, studied them obsessively, tried to live by them. But he also understood that honor couldn't be separated from morality, that following a code that led to immoral outcomes wasn't honorable at all. It was just rigidity masquerading as virtue. True honor, the kind that actually meant something, required you to think, to weigh competing values, to make hard choices that might look dishonorable on the surface, but served a greater good. This is why the story of what Patton did after that German commander said, "You'll have to kill me," matters. It's not just a quirky anecdote from World War II. It's a case study in moral leadership, in the ability to see past superficial differences and find common ground, in the courage to offer an adversary a way to do the right thing while preserving their dignity. Patton could have humiliated that German commander, could have broken him psychologically, could have made his surrender an act of abject defeat. Instead, he gave him a way to frame his surrender as an honorable act, as a commander making a hard choice to save his men's lives. And in doing so, Patton demonstrated a kind of honor that went beyond any warrior code, an honor rooted in recognition of our common humanity. In the decades since World War II ended, military leaders have continued to grapple with these same questions. When do you fight, and when do you surrender? What does honor demand in a world where warfare has become increasingly destructive, where the old rules seem inadequate to the new realities? The answers aren't simple, and they vary depending on circumstances. But the principle that Patton demonstrated in that room with that German commander remains relevant. True honor isn't about blind adherence to a code. It's about having the wisdom to know when the code serves justice and when it serves only pride. The German commander went to his grave, decades later, believing that his encounter with Patton had taught him something fundamental about the nature of duty and honor. He never became a pacifist, never renounced his military service entirely, but he did come to believe that the warrior ethos he had been raised with needed to be tempered with moral wisdom, with a willingness to question orders and codes when they led toward evil. In his later years, he spoke to groups of young Germans about his experiences in the war, and he always included the story of his surrender to Patton. He framed it not as a moment of weakness, but as the moment when he finally understood that true strength sometimes meant laying down your weapons, that true courage sometimes meant admitting you were wrong. Patton, for his part, probably didn't think about the incident much after it was over. He was a man of action, always focused on the next battle, the next objective. By the time he died in that car accident in December 1945, he had moved on to worrying about the Soviet threat, about the future of Europe, about his place in history. But those who were in that room that day, who witnessed the conversation between these two warriors from different worlds, never forgot it. They told the story to their families, to historians, to anyone who would listen. Because it was a story about how even in the midst of war, even between enemies, understanding and respect are possible. How honor and morality aren't always in conflict, and how sometimes the most honorable thing you can do is to help your enemy make the right choice. In our own time, when conflicts seem intractable and understanding between enemies seems impossible, when warriors on all sides claim to be fighting for honor and justice, this story offers a different model. It suggests that true leadership isn't about defeating your enemies at any cost, but about finding ways to achieve your objectives while preserving human dignity, while acknowledging that your enemy is also a human being facing impossible choices. Patton, of all people, demonstrated this principle. Patton, the man who was famous for his aggression, his profanity, his absolute determination to destroy the enemy, showed that even he understood there were times when mercy was more powerful than violence, when offering an honorable way out was better than forcing a fight to the finish. The city where this surrender took place was rebuilt after the war, like so many German cities. The scars of battle gradually faded, though they never entirely disappeared. People who lived through those final days of the war told stories to their children and grandchildren about the terror of the bombardment, the relief when the fighting finally stopped, the strange mixture of defeat and liberation that characterized Germany's surrender. But very few of them knew about the conversation that had taken place between an American general and a German commander, the conversation that had probably saved their lives. That's often how history works. The big, dramatic moments get remembered and celebrated, while the smaller, more human moments fade into obscurity. But sometimes those smaller moments reveal more truth than all the grand narratives combined. The story of what Patton did after a German commander said, "You'll have to kill me," is one of those smaller moments. It won't change your understanding of World War II's grand strategy, won't alter the balance sheet of who won and who lost, but it might change how you think about honor, about leadership, about the possibilities for understanding even between people who are supposed to be mortal enemies. And maybe that's the real lesson here. War brings out both the worst and the best in human nature. It creates situations where people commit terrible atrocities, where the normal moral restraints seem to evaporate, where hatred and fear drive people to do things they would never do in peacetime. But it also creates moments of extraordinary moral courage, of people rising above the circumstances to act with honor and compassion. Patton's conversation with that German commander was one of those moments. Two men who should have been simply enemies, who had every reason to hate each other, found a way to connect on the basis of a shared understanding of what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to bear the weight of command, what it meant to make choices that would haunt you for the rest of your life. The weapons of World War II are now museum pieces. The soldiers who fought on both sides are nearly all gone, their stories fading with them. The cities that were reduced to rubble have been rebuilt, often more beautiful than before. The political systems that clashed so catastrophically have been transformed or disappeared entirely. But the moral questions raised by that war remain as relevant as ever. When do you fight, and when do you seek peace? What does honor require of you? How do you balance duty to your cause with duty to your common humanity? How do you make the right choice when all the choices available to you are terrible? General George S. Patton Jr. wasn't a philosopher. He was a warrior, a man who loved battle and studied it with the passion that others brought to art or music. But in that room with that German commander, he showed wisdom that went beyond military tactics, beyond warrior codes, beyond the narrow definition of honor as never surrendering and never showing weakness. He showed that sometimes the most honorable thing you can do is to give someone else a way to be honorable, to build a bridge between rigid codes and moral reality, to choose understanding over triumph. And in doing so, he saved lives, ended suffering, and demonstrated that even in the depths of humanity's most destructive war, there was still room for humanity itself.